Joining us now, Jesuit Conference President Father Timothy Kasecki, Director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame, and NBC News analyst, Kathleen Sparrows Cummings, and President and Editor-in-Chief of America Media, Father Sam Sawyer. Father Sawyer interviewed Pope Francis in November 2022. Father Kasecki, Pope Francis was also the first Jesuit pope. We saw him yesterday celebrating Easter Sunday. He was at St. Peter's Basilica on Saturday. He visited, in person. He visited a prison last Thursday. We knew he was sick. How do you see these last few days full of these gestures, full of him trying to connect with the people? How does that tie into the legacy of the man we knew over the last few years?
We know how much Pope Francis loved people, and he loved going out into the crowds. You remember when he first became Pope, they had to hold him back because he was always running to the crowds. And so I have to believe he did not want to die in a hospital, and he was able to come back to his home. He was able to go into St. Peter's Basilica and even do that famous blessing from the balcony at St. Peter's Square and feel the love of the people and share his love with them.
I was lucky enough to be there for an audience when Secretary Blinken went in December. And to your point, he called all the children in the audience to come up and sit around him. He did a bunch of laps in the Pope Mobile, and you could see his face light up as he drove by people. You know, Kathleen, we talked about Pope Francis being seen as a trailblazer and a bit of a reformer. Now, he was a traditionalist, to be fair, but he also didn't stray away from addressing things like church scandals or embracing immigrants or criticizing certain politicians. And he also upset many in the church by reaching out to the LGBT community. You know, when he was first pope, there was that moment on the plane where someone asked him about a gay priest, and he said, well, who am I to judge? Can you talk about where he has moved the church in terms of policy and outreach and practice in some of those places?
That truly was a remarkable moment. Who am I to judge? The larger context for that statement, the larger part of that statement, he said, if someone is eagerly searching for God, then who am I to judge? There are many people who believed that it was the job of a pope or a spiritual leader to judge. And Pope Francis believed that the main job of a spiritual leader, of himself as pope, was to accompany people, to be a pastor. So what Pope Francis did was emphasize that it was important to meet people where they were in their search for God and for the church to be with them. He talked about a church that went out to the peripheries, and he modeled that in so many ways. So I think that is what made him so beloved among so many people. And as others have said, his joy in being with people, I won't forget the images of him in the crowd yesterday, clearly ailing, but on the greatest day in the Christian calendar, day of joy, that there he was going through the crowd, being close to the people. Those who have met him know that he feels people's presence. He looks right into their eyes. He feels them deeply. That's what gave him joy. And I think despite his suffering in this last week, he wanted to make sure that he was with the people and for the people to know that he was with them.
Father Sawyer, as we've talked about already, he also wasn't afraid to shy away from some controversies or wade into politics. In your interview with Pope Francis, you focused on this polarization both in politics and in the church. What stuck out to you about how he viewed that, and how was that reflected in his church leadership over the last 12 years?
I remember him saying very forcefully in answer to the question about polarization is not Catholic. And that's how one of the ways we headlined the interview as well. He was convinced of the value of dialogue, of the idea that people could speak frankly with each other, could speak across difference, even when they didn't completely agree with one another, and that something more unifying could emerge from that dialogue. Certainly, we saw that in his commitment to the synodality process over the last 2 years, the Synod on Synodality, that he really is trying to call the church to a conversation. So rather than just assuming that there is one answer and everybody will get on board with it, to actually have us talk about the places where we differ and where we struggle to come to consensus and to try to find our way forward together. I think he committed himself to that, but he was also, as you pointed out, he was unafraid to speak clearly, especially in defense of human dignity. So speaking clearly about our need to care for migrants, for people who are on the margins of society's care, people who are poor and vulnerable. He also always included the unborn in that as well. So he was very clearly speaking up for justice. He wasn't afraid of the fact that that would ruffle some feathers politically.
Father Kosicki, we talked about his Jesuit tradition, but he also, I was reading this morning, was a bit uncomfortable with some of the trappings of office, especially when he first got there, and was surprising people, like doing things like when he was hungry, getting up and microwaving his own food, not waiting for somebody to bring it to him, or he would show up to these events in different countries in, tiny little compact cars. He didn't need a limousine. And now we understand that he's going to be buried in a more humble lead-lined coffin, and he's going to be the first pope in more than a century to be buried outside the Vatican. Why do you think he wanted to do that? And is that a surprise break in tradition, or knowing how he lived, does that make sense?
Very little surprises me with Pope Francis. And beginning with your last question, he really loved Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Blessed Mother. In the church where he will be buried in Italian, Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, one of the major basilicas in Rome. And he even brought everyone to see where he's going to be buried. So it's part of his piety, as I think, as well as that church is near the train station. So it's kind of the crossroads in Rome where the people come and go. That's where he will be buried. And his choice to drive around in the little Fiat Punto to live in a humble residence as opposed to the apostolic palace is just part of his character, his passion, and I think part of his witness as a shepherd.
I mean, it is a cute car. It is kind of emblematic of the Pope Mobile. Maybe that was just his vibe. Kathleen, I also want to ask you about, of course, what comes next. There's more than 100 men from the College of Cardinals that are technically eligible to become the next Pope, but the actual list is a little bit shorter than that. Can you explain the term papable, popable? I'm not even sure I'm saying that right. Can you explain that to us?
Papabile.
Oh, I was definitely not saying it right. Thank you.
There's no direct translation in English, but it's a person who is possible that they could become Pope. They have the qualities for that. And there's no definitive number of those. Yes, there are 135 members of the College of Cardinals who are under the age of 80 and therefore eligible to vote. Others, so of that list, there are people whose names are being talked about. Right now, the church is in a period of mourning for the Pope. This is a really interesting moment because it's been 20 years since we've had a moment like this. In 2013, there was a papal conclave that wasn't preceded by a papal funeral. And then a few years ago, after Pope Benedict died, we had a papal funeral that wasn't followed by a conclave. So this is back to the traditional sequence where there is a papal funeral. It's a period of mourning. The cardinals will all be converging on Rome. And before the conclave starts, there will be a series of days that are called the general congregations. And that's when each cardinal will have a chance to speak about what he believes the church needs in its next leader. And that's a really important, those are really important days because many of the cardinals will be meeting each other for the first time, particularly some of the newer ones, particularly some of those from the far-flung places that Francis appointed cardinals. And in fact, Pope Francis's intervention, well then Cardinal Bergoglio's intervention at the General Congregation before the March 2013 conclave, he gave a speech that really got him the notice of a lot of cardinals. He talked about a passage from the book of Revelation, Jesus knocking on the door. And he said, obviously, Jesus is knocking to get in, but what if Jesus is knocking to get out? And he talked about a church that went out to the peripheries. And that's what really, again, kind of bumped him up in the eyes of many. So those speeches are really important and those meetings are really important. And that'll happen before the conclave begins.